Welcome to the National Endowment for Democracy. It's awesome to have you here, in part because there are two things that I think are really important for this morning. One, we have a great partner with us in GLOBSEC who's here, and we have a really important topic, how to maintain solidarity, unity in Europe, particularly at a time for Ukraine. So I first want to acknowledge the GLOBSEC team that's here. Welcome. It's great to have you here in Washington. Dominika, Katerina, we've got the extended, Elena, Anna, the extended GLOBSEC team is here as well. My regards to Robert Vash. For those of you who don't know GLOBSEC, it is one of the most important voices, independent voices in Central Europe about the future of Europe, about the future of the transatlantic community, about the future of global trends. And we're going to hear a little bit about that this morning on how focus on democracy in Central Europe and Eastern Europe amid war in Ukraine, how these are related topics. And we're doing this at a moment that obviously is consequential. You watch the drama unfold over the weekend in Russia with significant implications for what's happening in the region. We're in the midst of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south and east. We see laid bare the weakness of the Putin regime. And many of you have been involved in pretty intense efforts to focus on Ukraine emerging stronger, on Ukraine's recovery. And that is a top priority for us, for our team who is here at the Endowment. How does Ukraine emerge from this horrific war as a stronger democracy, as a stronger free country? And that is the best victory over the Russian assault. This report and reading through it raises some concerns and some alarm bells, but it reminds us, I think, why we believe it's time to be on offense in favor of freedom and how that has to manifest in rallying behind Ukraine in war and in peace. It's pretty obvious, and GLOBSEC has been a champion of this, that European unity is essential in maintaining support to Ukraine. And therefore, understanding the risks, the threats, the things that pull at that unity, they need to be recognized, they need to be addressed, they need to be discussed. We'll do that today. And it's why we're excited to have them after year presenting comparative data from across, I think, 8 countries in Central and Eastern Europe, from the Baltics to Eastern Balkans, helping to give a sense of where our people stand. Because after all, we are democracies, we listen to our people, they have a say and an impact on this. And for us, we bring sort of a rock-solid commitment to both of these topics. How to support democracy in the region and be standing by those who believe in bolstering the democratic institutions, values, and practices across the region, and how to ensure that democracies are standing united in support of a free Ukraine. And there are some trends that are disturbing that will come out in the conversation, whether it relates to governments, human rights, populism, hybrid warfare that we see, disinformation. These are not unique to the region. These are not unique to GLOBSEC studies in the past. But we've also really seen a positive government civil society approach in many of these countries on how to work together to respond not only to the massive humanitarian crisis as a result from Russia's attacks in Ukraine, but also how to couple that with support for justice, accountability, atrocities in Ukraine. And this is where we're leaning in. We're leaning in on freedom of expression, freedom of the media, support to rule of law, transparency, human rights, democratization everywhere. And ultimately, that means how does Central Europe, the benefits that it's enjoyed as it transitioned to be anchored in Europe, to be anchored in the alliance, how are those benefits enjoyed by the Ukrainian people who are fighting to defend all of our freedom, to welcome them into Europe, to welcome them into our alliance? We'll hear from that from I suspect, one of our important Ukrainian guests who's with us. Daria, welcome back to NED. It's great to have you here. And just to underscore that everything we are working on here at the Endowment, the challenges to democracy, freedom, challenges everywhere, I don't think anything is more important to the trajectory, the outcome of many of these debates in countries around the world than Ukraine's victory. I think that, more than any other thing, will shape the outcome and trajectory of freedom and democracy as we look forward. And that's why our partners in Central and Eastern Europe, standing firmly beside their neighbor in Ukraine, is at the core of what we're going to hear about today, where there are strengths, where there are weaknesses, and how to tackle that. So with that, Asia, come on up, and I'll have you and guest our GLOBSEC guests, and I'll turn it over to you, Asia Vancheva, the lead of our Europe program here. Over to you, Asia.
Thank you, Damon, for your always inspiring, welcoming remarks. Thanks, everyone, for joining us at 9 o'clock in the summer to hear from our GLOBSEC partners about their research findings on public attitude in Central and Eastern Europe. I think all of you are aware of the importance of European solidarity and unity with Ukraine. And while there was a huge outburst of enthusiasm and solidarity with Ukraine in the first months of the war, the more the time passes, the more fragile this unity is. There are many events in town that are dedicated to Ukraine, Euro-Atlantic Security Alliance, etc. But there aren't that many that look specifically at the country level, at public attitudes, at vulnerabilities, risks, and ways of addressing those. So it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage our main speakers, Dominika Hajdu and Katarina Klingova from GLOBSEC. Please join me here. And before giving you the floor, I'd like to introduce you a little bit further. For everyone here on your chairs, you have the invite with their bios, but just briefly, Dominika is the director of the Center for Democracy and Resilience at GLOBSEC, and Katarina is the senior research fellow at the same center. The center is dedicated to studying social media information operations, and how to build better resilience in the countries mostly of Central and Eastern Europe, but also beyond. They have presented their findings at the GLOBSEC's flagship event this year in May, and we've all heard the wonderful impressions of the many participants. It's a forum that gathers leading policymakers, civil society representatives, experts. In fact, one of our guest participants today, Daria Kalinuk, also a partner of ours, was also a speaker there. And for those of us who missed it this year, we have the pleasure of having GLOBSEC's team here with us today. So without much further ado, I'm just going to turn to Dominika to start with the presentation, and then we'll open it for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Asia, and thank you very much for the National Endowment for Democracy and to Damon for having us and for having the opportunity to be able to present the findings of our research. So we'll have a short presentation together with Katarina for about 15 minutes, and then we look forward to the conversation and into going more in depth when it comes to the research results. So the GLOBSEC Trends research, we have been conducting. It's based on a public opinion polls that we have been conducting across Central and Eastern Europe since 2016. So it's already been ongoing for around 8 years. The aim of the research is always to look at to what extent the public believes key narratives that are being spread in the information spaces. That's why a lot of times you can find questions that we're asking a bit misleading, the questions that we're asking a bit also controversial, but this is because we are seeing these narratives being circulated in the information spaces in Central Europe, but also Western Europe and other parts of the world, mostly by, of course, Russian, by the Chinese sometimes, but also by other actors that are trying to undermine our democracies and the transatlantic unity. So this is our methodological approach, and it also allows us to see where are the key vulnerabilities, which are the key narratives that resonate, and where are the areas where we should put more focus. Our research is based on we're always doing it with a market research agency, so it's always based on a representative sample of at least 1,000 respondents. It's a standard method. The sample is representative of gender, age, education, region, and income, so that we really grasp the entire population. The data was collected by the end of March 2023. So we have a snapshot of some of the results. The reports are also there in the bag, and there's more findings included in the report itself. So, of course, the key topic that we have covered this year is the Russian war in Ukraine, and how the war is being perceived by the people in Central and Eastern Europe. And the question we asked for the second year in a row is, who do you think is primarily responsible for the war in Ukraine? And as you can see in the results, the perceptions differ very much between the countries. On one hand, there is Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, so the Baltic countries and Poland and the Czech Republic as well, where the overwhelming majority believes the truth, so that this is Russia that invaded Ukraine, who's the primary actor responsible. On the other hand, there are countries like Bulgaria and Slovakia, where more people actually believe the disinformation narrative, the misleading narratives, that it's actually the West or Ukraine who's primarily responsible for the war. So we're seeing the impact of the long-term disinformation, the long-term efforts to undermine the belief in the West, to undermine the support for Ukraine, at least since 2014, that has been spread in countries like Bulgaria and Slovakia. This is the impact that we're seeing on the attitudes of the people. Then we also looked at the narratives that are being spread on the specific topics. We look at the level of support to economic sanctions. And overall, the average 59% of the respondents across the region think that economic sanctions against Russia work and should be in place until Russia withdraws its soldiers from the Ukraine. At the same time, and these were the two different statements we asked. So do you agree or disagree that economic sanctions work and they should remain in place? Do you agree or disagree that economic sanctions against Russia are ineffective because they do not harm Russia? And at the same time, around 50% of people agree also with the second statement. And this is due to different reasons. And we see the different reasons actually on the graph here. So as you can see, while the majority, again, in countries like Poland, Czechia, also Latvia, Lithuania, Romania believe that the sanctions should remain in place, the distribution of people who think that economic sanctions are ineffective because they do not harm Russia is also very strong in all of the countries. And this is because of different reasons we found out. In countries like Bulgaria and Slovakia, the reasons are that people actually believe the narrative that the sanctions shouldn't be in place because they're also hurting economies in Central Europe or in Europe. On the other hand, in Poland or Romania, a lot of people believe that the sanctions are ineffective because they should be harsher. And they want the sanctions be actually stronger because they do not currently harm Russia, because Russia is able to circumvent the sanctions through the deals. But we're seeing how different how this one narrative has different connotations in different countries, and how it is interpreted differently actually across the region by the respondents based on what are the key narratives or what are the overarching attitudes in the given country. Second topic we covered regarding the narratives about the war was the provision of military equipment and the arms supply. Very positive finding is that almost 3/4 of the respondents think that by providing military equipment and weapons to Ukraine, our country is helping Ukraine defend itself against Russia. So they believe it's necessary, it's needed. At the same time, almost half believes the narrative that by providing the equipment and weapons to Ukraine, our country is provoking Russia and is bringing itself closer to the war. And we know this is the narrative that is often being utilized by a lot of actors who are trying to undermine the military support for Ukraine. And as we see the distribution across the countries, the patterns copy the previous slide. So there is Slovakia, Bulgaria on one hand, and Poland, Lithuania on the other. But you really see how how in some countries the fear or the exploitation of the fear and utilization of the fears against populations can be effective or are already being effective in Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria. So this is a narrative very sensitive for these three countries. Another topic that we covered was refugees, the support for refugees. So, the numbers are quite similar to the provision of the military equipment. So 73% in the region believe that their country needs to continue supporting Ukrainian refugees because they're fleeing the war. So the solidarity is there, the solidarity is prevalent. At the same time, more than a half believe that Ukrainian refugees receive support at the expense of their own citizens from socially vulnerable groups who needed more. And why we especially ask this question is because we have been getting feedback. We have done a research about refugees at the end of last year, and really across the V4, and the prevalent opinion also in Poland and Czech Republic was that, of course, the refugees need to be supported, the refugees require help, but people on the ground were telling us that there are some tensions bubbling under the surface. And we really wanted to capture that. And I think we were able to capture that with the narrative of the fact that, yes, we need to help the refugees, but actually the support is going at the expense of our citizens. And this narrative is also prevalent in countries like Poland, right? Which are actually providing a lot of help and a lot of assistance to refugees. And it just shows us to what extent the population is already getting sensitive to the provision of help to Ukrainian refugees. So this is another area which can very well be exploited by some of the populist actors and actors who are trying to undermine the support for Ukraine. As you can see in countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, actually more people already believe that Ukrainian refugees are favored at the expense of their own citizens. Then we also asked the respondents about how they perceive the other partners and other large powers across the world. And I pass the word to Katerina.
Thank you. So we looked into what are the most strategic partners of Central Eastern Europeans. The question was framed, which of the following 6 actors they had the possibility to choose out of these six countries. And they could choose two countries that they considered as the most important strategic partners for their own countries. As we can see, with the war, Germany, which has been traditionally perceived as the most important strategic partner in terms of economy, but also in terms of security, has been declined. The impact of their indecisiveness, the slow response really resonated amongst the Central Eastern Europeans. On the other hand, United States tying up with the Germany is a reflection that the Central Eastern Europeans really understand the need of a bigger presence of the United States in the region. They understand that U.S. is a security guarantor, and in the times of war, we really need hardcore security guarantors to be much more present in the region. Obviously, with the war, we've seen the decline of Russia being perceived as a strategic partner. China, overall, there's a very low understanding of China being as a strategic partner, but also being perceived as a security threat. However, when we break down these perceptions into the countries, we see that there are still countries as Hungary, Bulgaria, but also Slovakia, where you have 25%, one quarter of the population that still continue to perceive Russia as the most important strategic partner for their countries. This showcases that resilience building, is a long-term thing. This showcases that just because Russia invades another country, certain population, certain segments of population will not change their perceptions. And we see that the perceptions do not change from one day to another. So resilience building is really a long-term thing that we need to really focus on. This year we asked, why do you perceive Russia or, the countries that people named as the most important strategic partner for their country, why do you perceive these countries as the most important partners? And as we can see, in case of Hungary and Slovakia, it was mainly the dependence of strategic raw materials that was voiced as the reason. In Hungary, it was also the favorable attitude of the government, Orban's declarations and often visits really resonated among the public. But on the other side, we see Bulgaria, which is based on common history, common culture, And this is something that, you don't change that from one day to another. In case of Slovakia, we turn our independence on Russian raw materials, and you can change that with good strategic communication, which we think has been lacking, because people still believe this old narratives that have been resonating for years and years. When we look at the perceptions of Russia being a security threat, overall the region, majority says yes, Russia is a security threat, but at the same time we see big differences between the countries. And Hungary and Bulgaria continue to be the two countries, something that we've seen already in the previous year, that still majority do not perceive Russia as a security threat, despite the fact that the war is basically happening next door to their countries. Unfortunately, we see also a big impact of the intensive and long-term information operations smear campaigns against the United States. As you can see on this chart, 50% of Slovaks, but also 33% of Bulgarians perceive the United States as a security threat. Slovakia is obviously an outlier in the region. And this is, once again, an impact of the long-term smear campaigns and very active disinformation actors. And in the past years, also increasing number of domestic political leaders that have been using this anti-American pro-Kremlin narratives, portraying the United States as a security threat. When we looked into the perceptions of the leaders of these countries, we see that the democratic leaders are really well positively perceived by the Central Eastern Europeans. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin or Chinese President Xi Jinping are not so well perceived by the Central Europeans, which is a good sign. Another topic that we look into was the belief in democracy and media. Interesting thing we've been observing for several years now is that when we ask a question, where do you think that democracy based on the system of equality, human rights, rule of law is a good form of governance? Majority of Central Eastern Europeans say, yes, of course, we want to have this form of governance. Where can we sign up? If you change the sentence just by putting liberal in front of the democracy, it immediately drops. In some countries, it drops by a few percentages. In some countries, it drops by 28 percentage points, 26 percentage points. So what this showcases to us is, first of all, people do not understand that the democracies that they're living in is actually liberal democracy. They do not understand what democracy stands for. And by seeing the big drop in case of the framing with the liberal as an adjective to democracy, we see the impact of long-term smear campaigns against anything liberal in the region. It could have been attacks on liberal policies, liberal political parties, but also just like a liberal thinking that is based on really equality of human rights when it comes to LGBTQ plus community or gender issues that have been used in disinformation smear campaigns in the region. When we looked into the trust in media, which is an important part of the society, we see that on average, 52% of Central Eastern Europeans believe that the standard media is completely free in their country, but the widespread distrust in institutions, whether they're public or in this case of media, also resonates, and only 42% of Central Eastern Europeans think that they trust the media, trust the standard media. This is a breakdown because once again we see big differences between the countries. Czechia, Slovakia, Romania, those are the countries where majority of the respondents think that the standard media is completely free, but there's big differences in whether they also think and trust that the media is free, but then they trust the information that is being provided by these institutions.
So when it comes to the key findings that we wanted to convey today, first of all, it is important to acknowledge that security is again one of the priorities for the people who are feeling insecure. And the insecurities have been building with the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, but now with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we're seeing that on the perception of the US, we're seeing that also on the perception of NATO. We didn't have that in presentation, but also the support for the NATO membership has increased really, really sharply. And also the understanding of NATO as a security guarantor for the region. Also, the support for Ukraine remains high, and Russia is seen as a threat, but the narratives that are trying to undermine the support for Ukraine are resonating among people, are resonating differently in different countries. So there really needs to be a more focus on what kind of narratives that are undermining the support for Ukraine are resonating within these different countries. Also, it's important to understand that the region is not one, it's not united, and that there different kind of attention needs to be put in different countries, and that also the region agrees on the importance of democracy, but the trust crumbles, and democracy is probably understood in different ways in the different countries. And we have also a few recommendations.
So the first recommendation is that we need to explain to our people, to Central Eastern Europeans, why the support for Ukraine is so important for our own societies, not only when it comes to democracy, but also security. We need to explain to them that, Ukrainians are also fighting for our countries, fighting for our democracies. Another thing is that for years within our polling, we've been seeing a big vulnerability to disinformation or conspiracy theories. So focusing on building cognitive defense of our societies, media literacy, critical thinking is one of the cores of how we can build the resilience of our societies and make us resilient to any kind of malign influence, whether it's coming from domestic or foreign actors. Another recommendation is that we need to focus on long-term measures, because resilience is a long-term measures. It comes with the will to invest, to conduct educational reforms, to build capacities both in public institutions, to both capacities in civil societies, and that's a long-term solution. You're not going to change certain things from one day to another. As it was shown, people do not understand what democracy stands for. So we need to tell them that democracy is not a checklist. Democracy is something that you constantly develop by active engagement, and that's one of the factors that we need to invite people to take part in democratic processes. We need to engage with those disengaged who gave up on democracy, who feel disillusioned that democracy or those democratic messages that were spread in the region in the beginning of the 90s, they never were delivered. And it showed them well, that's part of the democracy, you need to engage with it. We need to also strengthen our own strategic communication because we've seen that good strategic communication of many public institutions is lacking, but it shouldn't be just communication via social media platforms, but we need to engage in more face-to-face, one-on-one initiatives and communications. And we need to tell our own stories, we shouldn't be focusing on debunking, but people, societies that understand what are their true values, what are the principles they're worth fighting for, are much more resilient. And if we explain them in stories, and if they're based on emotions like pride or some kind of historical achievements, they are much more consistent, and they're much more ingrained in the people, and that's what we need. So thank you very much for your attention, and we are looking forward to the debate.
Thank you, Dominika and Katarina. You provided a wealth of information in terms of data, but also thank you for the recommendations. I would take the advantage of being a moderator to ask a warm-up question. You touched on it already, explaining why some countries are more pro-Russian than others. But I just wonder, given your longer experience in looking at the data since 2016, whether you see other factors that would explain this amazing, to me, regional diversity, country diversity within a region in Central and Eastern Europe, which to some degree, people perceive as homogeneous, and you were right. It's not one, one region. It does have shared history with Ukraine, shared history of communist past, linguistic, similarities, and yet you see some countries being the most adamant advocates of Ukraine and its EU and NATO membership, and you see others being very vulnerable to Russian disinformation. So could you please elaborate a little bit about that?
Okay, so I can start with a few factors. Definitely one of them is education and the level of critical thinking. And we could very nicely see that on the case of Czech Republic, which in the past wasn't that adamantly pro-Western, pro-EU, and was not very much pro-Russian, but was somewhere in between. And with the war in Ukraine, they immediately understood what's the right and what's wrong. And really, their resilience has shown within their ability to understand the world, understand what's going on. And I assign this mostly to their critical thinking, which is really higher compared to countries like Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania when it comes to the level of education. And this is evidenced in different measurement and test methods that are assessing the level of education and the ability of critical thinking across these countries. So I definitely say education. Then definitely a long-term resilience building efforts. We can see in the Baltics and Poland, the resilient building across the population when it comes to explaining and awareness raising about Russia as a threat, what does it mean, how to be prepared for the potential conflict, has been ongoing since 1989, basically, and also this awareness of Russia being a threat has been prevalent in these countries in the past. So this is definitely a factor, but I'll also let Katarina add more.
One of the factors that we've been observing is that in the really past 2 or 3 years, increasing number of domestic political actors are actually utilizing disinformation in order to win the hearts and minds of their voters. They really learned the tactics and tools of Kremlin playbook, and they're implementing it into their own political activities. And this is a problem because when we started with monitoring of disinformation in Central Europe back in 2014-15, disinformation or conspiracy theories were at the outskirts of our information sphere. Now you switch on the TV and you have, in prime times, we have political leaders who, within their work, within their activities, are spreading conspiracy theories at prime news, and that is problematic. But that also reflects us us in the sense that what kind of political culture we want to support, what kind of political culture we want to build. And that's something that we as individuals, as citizens, need to realize, that we give these political actors the power, we vote them in. So it's all about also self-reflections of what do we want to, how do we want to, what kind of society we want to become, what kind of country we want to become, where do we stand for, what side in history we want to stand for, and how do we want to be perceived now or in future. And as Domika said, certain things are long-term. It's not something that's going to change from one day to another. And that's the thing that we need to start building our own society, both from bottom up, but also from top-bottom by by making sure that we push the political leaders to implement important reforms that will make our societies much more resilient.
Thank you both. Katarina, I can agree more with you that it's a matter of political leadership, and the more authoritarian leaning the leaders are, the more susceptible the country is to Russia's malign influence. All right, let me just open it to questions from the audience. I'll take one question and then turn to our guest participant here. Anyone? Yes, please. Yes.
Thanks. Kevin Shires, International Forum here at NED. Maybe you could educate me a little bit on some of the regional differences here. Mainly, what surprised me so much was the differences between Romania and Hungary. So there was, very strong support for the U.S. as a security partner in Romania, but a lot of trust in Russian narratives in different ways, and also not a lot of support for Ukrainian military and humanitarian assistance, I believe, as well. Anyways, it just was surprising given how strong Romania is as sort of a NATO partner and ally. And then I was surprised by the lack of Hungary being in a completely different camp on its own, given some of the domestic environment there. It was sort of similar in a lot of ways to Bulgaria and Slovakia and some of the others. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, if there's anything you guys picked up, or if there's something I'm missing about sort of what's going on in Romania, for example.
Okay, so when it comes to Romania, one of the things we have been observing is that indeed the support for the West and for the US is prevalent in the country, and as it has been for the past decades. But at the same time, their susceptibility to believe disinformation is high due to the lack of critical thinking and the lower lower level of education in the country, and we have been measuring that also during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the trust in misinformation about the COVID has been, or the susceptibility to trust this kind of misinformation was quite high in Romania as well. And when we consulted also with Romanian partners, is that a lot of people who have picked up this anti-COVID misinformation during the COVID pandemic and started to follow these media that were spreading this kind of misinformation, stayed with the media, which then started spreading anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian narratives. And this is how basically they started also believing these narratives because they have already built the trust within these sources that have been spreading misinformation and propaganda. So I would say that it's not an expression of the declining support for the West and for the US, but an inability to actually assess the information critically in that country that is driving the belief in this misinformation. I don't know if you'd like to add on Hungary.
When it comes to Hungary, for years we've been observing big support and strong support in institutions as the European Union or NATO. And when from those disinformation narratives connected to the war in Ukraine, big majority, they were leading in this sense. The region, I think it was 90% of Hungarians supported or wanted to support and continue supporting the Ukrainian refugees. So what we are seeing is the impact of the Orban's, let's say, propaganda and closeness to authoritarian countries as Russia and China, in sense of perception of strategic partnership, both in terms of Russia and China, their importance for the country. But at the same time, in certain countries, certain questions indicate us that Hungary is not just the Orban's government, that we need to be trying to find those democratic voices in the regions, and then we need to engage with the people because, there is a big difference in what is being said by the leading politicians and where the public perceptions stand.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to let's call her guest participant, Daria Kalinuk, who is the founder and the lead of the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Action Center and a passionate advocate for her country, domestically, internationally. She's also the founder of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. She's this week in Washington having a number of meetings. She can tell you more about her mission, but also I'd welcome any comments from Daria. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today, Daria.
Thank you very much. It's extremely interesting. First time I've seen the report in GLOBSEC, and it was fascinating. Obviously, it is very worrying for Ukrainians to see Slovakia and Bulgaria blaming the West for triggering the war. And we obviously we would need to find jointly together the way how to deal with these narratives. As a suggestion for probably further research, I would like to encourage you to do probably a measurement of support of these countries of Ukraine's NATO membership, and that's an important thing to discuss with citizens across these countries, because now we have to discuss the end game scenarios of Russia's war in Ukraine. So, and we've produced the report, which is called the End Game Scenarios for Russia's war in Ukraine. Basically, we see that Russia is not just Putin. And within Kremlin, there are different stakeholders and different power brokers. Many of them are economically motivated. And absolute majority of Russian Kremlin power brokers are multi-dollar multimillionaires or dollar multi-billionaires with a link, economical link to the West. And by the way, we see that in the Central Europe, like in Slovakia and Bulgaria, there are quite a lot of wealthy Russians which used to have or still have mansions, and they send their kids there. And we see that the more Russia loses at the battlefield, the more there is military aid and the united strong resolve of the NATO allies, the more economically motivated Kremlin elites are getting influence on Putin. And the more attractive it is for Kremlin to end the war, if they will stay in power. So power continuity for Kremlin elites is number one priority, and they are using the war to reach this. But if they have losses at the battlefield, they are more open to any discussions and any ways out of this war. And we see that more and more Russian and Kremlin elites inside even the Putin circle understand that this war was a mistake. However, these disinformation trends which are happening in Central Europe is indication where Russia will go next. They will win time and they will simply prepare better their narratives to split United Europe and to split United NATO. And they are perfect in doing disinformation campaigns. They know how to spread out the narratives. They know how to buy politicians, either directly or non-directly at the West. They have very good network all across Europe and NATO. So we see that it's very dangerous. The longer this war is happening, the better Russia will be performing. So I think we have jointly explained to Central Europeans, especially Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, that sanctions really matter, that military aid really helps save lives and protect Europe and guarantee security. And we can discuss how to do that together. Probably we can bring journalists from this region to Ukraine. Probably we could have some sort of joint event in the region, especially in the most painful countries. So anyway, I encourage those who would like to read the report about end war scenarios of Russia's war in Ukraine. There should appear the link to the QR code to the report. So take a chance to read it. There will be more events about this report. Probably we could also do jointly something with GLOBSEC to work on the audiences in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. This was excellent. Great ideas. Daria is here with us until the end of the event, so you can also direct questions to her. All right. Anyone else from the audience here? And Zach, do we have questions? I know that it's YouTube, so it's not the most conducive platform for interaction. But we had 40 participants confirmed for online discussions. Okay, here we go. Somebody from the audience, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Marcin Buzanski. I'm also a bit of an overseas guest. I came to join Daria on the event tomorrow to discuss the scenarios. I'm a senior advisor with the Pulaski Foundation and Warsaw Security Forum, also at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw, and a number of other things. Congratulations on the report. I think a very good and important study. A couple of points I'd want to pick up on and perhaps comment on, and also have questions to you. One, and this goes a little bit to what Daria mentioned, speaking about NATO membership, I'd say even more important in terms of this analysis and asking the questions in the regions would be Ukraine's EU membership, because that would really have a significant daily, felt impact on societies. And I think, it's something that in principle probably would have very strong backing, but when you actually break down the realities economically, socioeconomically, etc., that could potentially, raise risks where very important would be the right communication and engagement. So I think, trying to monitor those tendencies would be something of great value. The other thing, and I think you mentioned this a little bit on sort of growing authoritarian trends in the region. I'd elevate that risk. I think it's quite significant when you think about the electoral campaigns that we're, for instance, having now in Poland. It's a very fine line where Ukraine is still, let's say, on the safe side from getting really hit hard in terms of potential risks and labeling refugees as being problematic in the country. It's already happening in terms of the border with Belarus. It's happening in terms of trying to have a referendum within elections in Poland around allowing relocation of refugees from other EU countries, which is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And there are further to the right parties, which have a growing number of supporters, which tend to openly say, no, we shouldn't be allowing the same level of support for Ukrainian refugees. So if it tilts, I don't think that the current government in Poland would hesitate to use this if it meant staying in power or not. So this is a risk to be sort of aware of and really work very hard on to mitigate, whether it's from the civil society side, whether it's from influential government side like the UK, the US, etc., to put pressure not to go that way. And I think a question also to you is. Whether you looked at that kind of barometers also, for instance, in the Balkans, and sort of looked at the comparisons, look at the influences, because I think there could be a lot of interesting cross-cutting issues here to sort of learn and analyze it, particularly when we think of the broader theaters that could be manipulated for the very same purposes, high level that we talk in here. Thanks.
Thank you and welcome, Marcin. Absolutely valid comments. I'll let Dominika and Katarina talk about the Balkans, but I was just in the Balkans, so I can't agree with you more. You see escalating tensions around Serbia, Kosovo, non-dialogue, I would call it, and then Republika Srpska as part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, very closely aligning itself with Putin, really troublesome developments, especially given the legacy and the history of the region. But happy to say that there's vibrant civil society and advocates for Ukraine's cause that we support at that level. Turning to you.
So we were unfortunately not able to cover the Western Balkans in this report, although we're always looking to have the scope as wide as possible. And we'd be happy to explore maybe partnerships so that we can expand the coverage, because indeed the region of Western Balkans is of utmost importance also for the future of Europe and the peace in Europe as well. And we realize that. And when it comes to your comment about the membership, we actually asked this question last year. Although indeed it would be very interesting to see how also now with the Ukraine's advocacy about the Ukraine's membership in NATO, as it has increased in the past months, how have the perceptions of the citizen change. And I can tell you that from the last year, indeed, there the tendency to accept Ukraine as a member of the EU has been much higher, was much higher than it was for the NATO, because and I believe that last year, and we asked the question whether they would like for the Ukraine to be the member of the EU, NATO, both or neither. And the support for the EU was the strongest, I can tell you, and I believe for obvious reasons. Due to the fact that when you accept the country with the conflict to NATO, it has implications. But indeed, it would be extremely interesting to compare the data with this year.
Maybe to add, as you said, the polarizing narratives when it comes to the Russian, Ukrainian refugees, the war being waged. I mean, those are the things that we've been observing, and those are the things that we've been observing because Slovakia awaits snap election. We have elections on the 30th of September, and these are the narratives that have been used by the far extremists, but also by various mainstream political actors, saying that, if you're going to vote for this or that party, your sons and husbands are going to be sent to Ukraine to fight the war there, which was never the case. So the conspiracy theories and these narratives are being spread already. One thing that we've been also seeing is that in connection to the elections, the narratives undermining the democratic principles or saying that the elections itself is going to be somehow manipulated are very strong, very highly disseminated, and they resonate. According to our pollings, it's one of the questions is that 53% of Slovaks believe this narrative. So it's not about the war in Ukraine, but also about the disinformation narrative, polarizing narratives undermining our own democracy and democratic principles and trust in the system as such. That we need to really pay attention and pre-bunk and also actively debunk. But when it comes to the Ukraine's membership in the European Union or accession process to the EU and NATO, if the countries want Ukraine to become the member, and we ourselves believe it's important, it takes time. We need to communicate about the benefits, and that goes back to the good strategic communication. That's about showcasing on a real tangible, like in times of war, in times of economic crisis, energy crisis, in times of where you have two-digit inflation, people do not care about democratic principles. You need to transform the need to support Ukraine into something that influences their daily lives. You need to transform and communicate people in terms that they will feel, for example, on their bank accounts. And if you explain that Ukraine coming to the European Union will have huge benefits and it will lead to huge economic rise and cooperation in some of the regions of the countries, that's where that's the messages that the local people are going to reflect on and respond on.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Please.
Hey there. Thanks for this work. I'm Emma Lacey Bordeaux from CNN. I have an information-based question. You may or may not know. I'm just curious if you do. You talked about influencers and you talked about emotions. And obviously, one of the things that influencers are great at is capturing emotion and authenticity. Do you have a sense in the regions that you're working, are influencers, do they have formal relationships to work with people in positions of power? Or is it more like they're picking up on disinformation narratives that are already sticky? Or is it like a combination of the two?
Okay, so from what we've been observing, it's mostly that they're picking on these narratives because indeed they're popular and they are resonating and they're getting traction. There are a few influencers across the entire regions which have formal connections and they, I mean, there are also influencers among the party members who have built immense followership on Facebook's, Telegrams, and so on. A lot of them indeed are picking up because it's something, because it's also very attractive, because disinformation and propaganda is in a way attractive because it's scandalous, right? It's suggesting that this or that person is knows something the others, the mass doesn't know about, right? So it's something very sexy in a way for some of the influencers to use to get attraction.
Maybe on the other hand, there are a lot of influencers from YouTubers to, I don't know, activists that realize that disinformation has really impacted their own lives. And they themselves are actively trying to build the critical thinking and resilience towards such narratives. In case of Czech Republic, there has been this YouTuber named Kovy. He had a series of debates about, and him himself, you know, trying to warn his followers on the influence operation disinformation. You have a lot of climate change influencers trying to talk about the sustainability, trying to provide the need to recycle, and that's something that they themselves are doing because they feel the passion, feel the need, and realize the importance of the topic. But at the same time, a lot of governments are realizing that in order to reach certain societal groups, they need to reach out to the local voices, to the local influencers, and those kind of collaborations are also being picked on, which is, in our sense, fantastic because, you know, like a lot of communication campaigns need to be localized. You need to use and search those partners in the regions, and overall it builds that whole of society approach and whole of society approach in resilience building.
Thank you. Let me make a comment here based on what you said about the importance of local influencers, but I would say the importance of independent local media. I think this is the best way to counter disinformation, to support independent media that produces local content based on facts. And that's 1/3 of all the assistance that we provide to the region. And it's cross-cutting in Central Europe, but also in Western Balkans and a lot of Ukrainian actually outlets and media hubs as well. Now turning back to our discussion, any other questions? Any questions online? Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Jackson Leiden, part of the Washington Center program. My question is, you brought up Germany. Why aren't they like the lead country in Europe against Ukraine conflict? Is it because of the reliance on natural gas with Russia and the pipeline?
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, yes.
Okay. That in a sense, but also due to the history, like Germany was very reluctant to especially provide military aid because after the Second World War, they committed not to engage militarily in other countries due to the due to the Nazi regime and due to the Second World War that has been caused by Germany. So their reluctance to engage in Ukraine, especially when it comes to military aid, has been caused by that in the beginning mostly, and then has slowly changed over the course of a few months. And now actually Germany is one of the leading actors who are providing also military aid.
Some experts would argue that there was a sense of naivete, if you will, a lack of appreciation of how serious of a threat Russia is to the security of Europe and the rest of the world. And I think the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was eye-opening in many ways, and that was greatly assisted by the advocacy done by civil society actors like Daria and others in changing course. Yes.
But maybe just to add, to what you said, Asia, I think that, and this is a problem, of course, of a large part of Western Europe as well, the relations on high level with some of the key Russian financial oligarchs or strong financial groups has been thriving in some Western European countries. And this is something that still hasn't been fully tackled also with the sanctions, and definitely the principle of let's follow the money and let's stop the relationship building at a high level when it comes to Russian oligarchs is definitely one of the areas that still needs to be tackled and hasn't been resolved fully.
Absolutely. It's not just disinformation, it's actually financial interests and networks in Western Europe, as well as the countries you outlined. For example, Bulgaria, it's not just common history, it's actually having politicians directly on Russian payroll. And I think my hope is that currently there is a coalition government that's very pro-Western, and hopefully that's going to make a difference. And we are watching very intently the pre-election environment in Slovakia, in your home country, as well as in Poland, marching. I think these elections are incredibly important for Europe as a whole and the rest of the world in terms of European unity and continued support for Ukraine. All right. I see 2 hands at the back, 3 hands. Okay, let's collect 3 questions, and I also would turn to Daria right after. Let's start with you.
Thanks. I have a question about your recommendation regarding the need to not just debunk the narratives of other political forces, but to create a positive agenda. And I think that some of the governments that are in power, like specifically Hungary and Poland, are very good at proposing a clear ideological agenda. Like, it's very clear what they stand for. You know, in Hungary, obviously, and in Poland, there's a nationalist agenda with a trade-off between certain liberal democratic freedoms in exchange for social protections that are kind of the territory of the traditional social democratic left that's collapsed. So I have a question, but the more democratic opposition in these countries has a clear respect for democratic processes, but they don't always have quite as clear-cut of an ideological direction or a clear picture of the results that they're looking for. So could you talk a little bit about what this sort of positive agenda would look like outside of simply respect for democratic processes?
Positive agenda, and could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Mike Fidinsky. I work for the Solidarity Center in Washington, D.C.
Nice to have you here. Right. Can we go with the other questions? Yes. Can we get 2 more questions at the back?
All right, so hi everyone. My name is Jonathan Chen, and I'm also with the Washington Center. And thank you all for a fantastic discussion so far. I just have one question for you all. I'm sure you've all heard about the recent events in Russia with the near coup d'etat rebellion due to the dissatisfaction with Putin's bad leadership. What do you think this has, like, in terms of consequences for both Russia and Western support of Ukraine and democracy in the region?
Thank you. We were sure this question was going to come up after this weekend. Yes. And last question here at the back.
There's been plenty of evidence that the Russian Federation and so many of their allies have made appeals to social conservatism, especially anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. And it appears that now support for LGBTQ rights in Ukraine is at an all-time high. Do you feel that that is something that could influence rights about those causes in the region? Or is it something that is kind of temporary just to maintain support for Ukraine?
Thank you, and could you introduce yourself?
My name is Thomas Buchan. I'm with the Council for Sustainability and Community Development.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, yeah. So 3 different questions. Dominika, Catherine.
When it comes to the strategic communication or the understanding of what are the principles and values that we stand for, yes. One thing that we've been observing is that usually the let's say anti-system far-right extremists have a very clear agenda. They know what they stand for, and in my country, in Slovakia, the let's say more liberal, more Euro-Atlantically oriented political actors are everybody tries to, they're not really into cooperation because everybody wants to win their own ticket and wants to become an important political party. So one thing that we really need to understand is that the fight for the voter is going to still be there, but sometimes looking for a better picture or further outcomes should be the unifying actor for the opposition parties, who often themselves are quarreling in between each other, and that's not really positive in the long-term sense, because then nobody passes the threshold, and the unified, let's say, political actors are then getting into the parliament, which that's the principle of government and democracy itself. But what I was meaning when I was talking about the strong common principles is that when you go to the Baltics, immediately they know their history. They know who's the threat. In my country, it took several years. It took 16 years for us to have updated national and defense security documents where we were openly naming Russia as a security threat. So that kind of understanding of what is your history, which is often lacking, and where Dominika was also mentioning the need for educational reform, that goes back to understanding of what we as a democratic society went through in order to be where we are at the moment. How we came to become a democratic society, how we overcame the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia, how and why did we decide to become part of EU and NATO. Those kind of, it's not about opposition parties or any kind of political parties, but it's about the society knowing, okay, what are the hard lines that we never want to cross ever again, and knowing, what are the basic principles that we never want to give up on, while at the same time, not only from this polling but also previous pollings, we see that oftentimes the monetary aspects or security aspects are being much more important for ordinary people than the protection of human rights. And that is a problem because when we look at our history, our leaders have died for those human rights. So it's the lack of appreciation of what we have and the willingness to give up of those rights, protection, rule of law, that is kind of scary, that it indicates how vulnerable we are, that we believe in principles, but those principles themselves are very vague and are not very much deep-rooted. And that's something that we need to really work on. So knowing who's your enemy and knowing where are the hard lines, I think is very important. And that's a big difference in the countries. Because that not only influences, who becomes the ruling government, who gets into the parliament, but also it reflects, what the people themselves believe in and what they're willing to negotiate for. Yeah.
Okay, so on Russia, I think that it might affect, or it might take the some of the narratives, or it might take the advantage. Okay, let me start again. Sorry. I think that when it comes to the actors who are spreading pro-Russian propaganda, they won't be able to argue anymore about the fact that, you know, Russia is this especially military superpower, that the attempted coup by Wagner, I think, can be very well utilized also by the pro-Western actors to demonstrate that actually Russia is not a untouchable military superpower. And this is, I think, very important because in the past months, we also done a bit of a research about among people who actually want Russia to win the war. We were looking into what are the factors and what are the reasons behind that. And a lot of people just said that they believe that Russia should win because it will win nonetheless, because it's a superpower and the support for Ukraine will eventually fade, and they're just big and they're a military superpower, so they will win eventually. And I think that the situation now, and especially we'll see how it will evolve in the next months, obviously, with the potential crumble of or divisions between the military, between the army, might actually decrease the understanding of Russia as a superpower. And I think that this can actually help Ukraine and also the attitudes towards Russia in the long term. And when it comes to LGBTI+, we have been actually asking about the support for the LGBTI in the past years. And what we were seeing is that the support has been increasing in all countries, except for Slovakia, actually. I mean, the reasons are primarily demographic. So you have younger people who are more open, more tolerant, and older people who are less tolerant. This is universal for each country that we were polling. So that's the primary reason. But I also think that indeed what you've mentioned, the fact that some of the parties and some of the actors are so strongly advocating against, this is actually, and making the issue so polarizing, this is actually moving a part of the previously gray zone of the population towards supporting actually the LGBTI rights. And we could see that especially in Hungary and Poland, where now a majority of people support the rights of the LGBTI+ in the polling, including the right to marriage, which for us was, to be very honest, a bit surprising, but we can see that making it polarizing in a way also helps, because people are fed up with the policies and measures which are limiting the rights of the people to such an extent.
Thank you. Daria, you had your hand up, please.
I have some thoughts. No. I'm good here. So, did you measure how many Russian population and Russian-speaking population lives in each of the countries? It would be really interesting to compare the presence of Russians and the actual results of the sociology. Also, some ideas. And mixed with questions. We talked about presence of Russian capital, Russian money across the West, but also, as I've already told, we see presence in Slovakia, in Bulgaria, in Hungary, much less in Poland, much less in Lithuania. Are there any groups or investigative journalists or other groups of people, probably opinion leaders, who are exposing the presence of Russian dirty money in these countries? And if yes, is there any traction? Are there people who are willing to watch such kind of content? And what's the reaction on this content? And finally, the proposal, again, we would be happy to partner and bring opinion leaders from countries which are skeptics in Central Eastern Europe to Ukraine, get them in touch with Ukrainian opinion leaders, bring them to the front lines, get them hand-to-hand experience. So we would be really happy to further cooperation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Daria. You just created a new project for NED. We are fostering cross-regional cooperation from Ukraine to the Baltics to the Western Balkans. But I'll turn to the speakers to address some of your comments. Russian-speaking populations in these countries, that's a tough one, actually, and a few other comments.
Yeah, so we haven't mapped the Russian-speaking population in the countries. Obviously, we know of the Russian-speaking populations in the Baltic countries because there are considerable minorities there. There has been actually an interesting development in Latvia where the support for Ukraine and the West has been rising in the past 3 years, also to the extent that, because Latvia has around 20% of the Russian minority, also to the extent that it trespasses the level of, because in the past, it was usually the attitudes were divided, right, between the Russian minority and the Latvian population. And now we see that also the results are showing that a part of the Russian minority is also actually expressing pro-Western and pro-Ukrainian attitudes. So Latvia is really doing a good job in this sense. Also, when it comes to the cross-regional cooperation that you mentioned, Daria, I think it's extremely important. We, as GLOBSEC, we've done already 3 kind of trips, exchanges of this kind, that we indeed brought journalists, public leaders, politicians, MEPs to Ukraine, to Kyiv, to meet with the leaders. I think this is something that definitely should be fostered and could cover more countries, including the Western European countries, because it is, and to bring not only the political representatives, but also journalists and local journalists that indeed, as Dacia mentioned, would be then able to actually explain in a very easy to understand and appealing way to the local populations of the situation on the ground. We'd be happy to cooperate on that.
When it comes to the investigation of Russian money or Russian networks in Central Eastern European countries, this is something that is being investigated by a lot of actors. There's a fantastic project called V-Square that is funded by NED that brings together investigative journalists from Visegrad countries, that's Hungary, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, where they focus on this. The investigative center of Jan Kuciak. Jan Kuciak is he was a journalist that was killed 5 years ago along with his fiancée, is focusing on these kind of efforts. So there's an appetite for it. A lot of is being done. A lot of things are being revealed on a, let's say, monthly basis or every other month, because really good investigation takes time. When we look into, what kind of investigative let's say, investigations are winning media awards. These are usually in the top 3 or oftentimes winning. Of course, the impact or their visibility depends on in which countries you're at. If you're talking about Hungary, where a lot of media environment is really, let's say, state captures, it's the investigative independent media outlets that are in an opposition that are trying to bring this kind of things, but only a certain part of population is going to be able to reach that kind of stuff. The same goes with Serbia, So there's an appetite. It's been going on. We just need to continue the work, and the support of investigative research, investigative journalism is an important element in building resilience and in making sure that this kind of facts are being brought to light.
Yes, exactly right. We do support a lot of work by investigative journalists and their networks that are doing their work at incredible risk, personal risk, constant harassment. And these networks include Bulgaria and Romania, Central Europe mostly. We have some of the Europe team here from NED that can provide more information if anybody is interested, sitting here at the back of the room. But we actually would love to have more projects like that. As you know, NED operates on demand, so we rely on ideas from journalists. And you're completely right, Katerina, because the issue is often access in the media landscape that's monopolized. It's very hard to get the message out. And also, you know, you, Daria, mentioned that it's great to have Ukrainian representatives of Central and Eastern Europe, whether civil society or political leaders go to Ukraine, and vice versa. Let's think of ways in which we can connect powerful Ukrainian voices to tell their story through independent media that we support in the region. Okay, please go ahead.
Maybe to just add to what you said, and a lot of Central Eastern Europeans, especially those that are vulnerable to disinformation, do not understand, you know, that if you want a good investigation, you have to pay for. And, you know, like good investigation journalism is behind the paywall. And ordinary people, you know, especially in Central Europe, they are not willing to pay for their news, especially if they can Google up and, you know, the disinformation outlets are right there providing explanation to events. So building that kind of knowledge is also an important thing that we should be focusing on. And there has been a great project or initiative in Slovakia a year ago where investigative journalists were going from one region to another region and organizing public debates in those regions. And for many of those people, that was the first time that they actually came face to face to the journalists, and they were able to see that, oh, okay, they're not the warmongers or they're not the boogeymans, you know, they're just ordinary people as me and you or the participants, and that they're trying to, you know, just inform people, not spread some kind of propaganda or wage information operations. And within this initiative, what they were doing was that they were giving out passwords to the participants of those events, so they themselves, you know, could read their work for several months. And I believe the feedback of it was very positive.
I know this question was already asked by the audience, somebody in the audience, but given the events of this weekend that captured the attention across the world, in Moscow, in Russia, I should say, how does this resonate in Slovakia or maybe other countries in Central Europe that you're aware of? And what kind of disinformation narratives have you heard or do you expect to hear around this? How could that be spun, let's say, to Moscow's advantage?
It really resonated. I mean, a lot of eyes were really on Russia over the weekend. There were big expectations. Of course, a lot of people, a lot of, you know, stakeholders, whether from political side, but also journalists or activists, we're very much saying that we need to be prepared for anything. I mean, this is a showcase that there are disagreements within the Russia, that, you know, the system is not so united as it appears or as it presents itself or tried to present itself. So in this sense, this is an opportunity for us to engage with certain political actors in Russia. But at the same time, okay, so the traditional conspiracy or disinformation was that it was there was an operation that was conducted by CIA. So that was kind of no-brainer. But what was funny to observe was that the traditional pro-Kremlin, let's say, actors were quiet in the first hours or first day. They themselves didn't know, you know, how to react. And a lot of pro-democratic actors were making fun of them, you know, like that the the comments and manuals of how to communicate that those events that have occurred in Russia haven't arrived yet. So they themselves were waiting for the involvement of the situation.
Taken by surprise.
Yeah, exactly,
Right? With no clear message coming from Moscow on how to communicate.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Thank you. One last question before we wrap it up. If there's any? Oh, two questions. Okay. Let's get these questions all together.
Hi, I'm Jesse Dimich-Louvet. I'm with House of Democracy, a German company. I guess my question is, like, there are very different definitions of democracy to many people around the world. What for you, for the panel, is a definition of democracy that we should sort of strive for to be more united as a world?
Let's have another question. Marcin.
Thank you very much. And if you allow me also for a quick comment on one thing before I ask my question, because there was here questions about Poland and the campaign and LGBTQ situation. And I must say, it's wavering, meaning that there's really a shift slowly happening in the country that's going to make this subject less and less of a difficult one. I think this is probably the last campaign where still, there's a generation that is going to pick this up as a problematic issue. But there's really a shift happening in the country. It's not sort of super dominant yet, but especially in cities, you can see it, and it's gradually changing. So I think that's obviously good, but not as quick as we'd want to. In terms of Germany, I think there was a question here about sort of the role and why have they been acting, and you've answered a lot of things. But I also, with Germany, there's this. I think it's like a tanker, that's starting to shift in one way, and it's really hard to get it to go into a certain direction. But if we can kind of get to lock it in at least after this shift on 25 degrees or something, and make it not turn back, then that's a very, very big success story already. So it requires a lot of work on that direction. And my question to you, we talked a lot about narratives and how sort of narratives and strategic communication needs to change to have the benefits of resilience in societies. I've had a couple of interesting ideas recently of sort of super quick counter narratives, but not engaging in a discussion as to not to increase polarization, that is critical here, but just to throw in a completely different subject as soon as possible, somewhat related but not related, and starting to really discuss a new thing. So to give you an example, there's a narrative starting again, against Ukrainian refugees or whatever, stealing things, and there are some trolls that are picking it up, and immediately there's a spread of information talking about great collaboration of Ukrainian kids and, let's say, whatever, Slovakian kids in schools, and that starts sort of trending immediately at the same time. And I don't know if you've come across examples of this technique or studied it in any case, and whether you think this is something that could really grow and be a useful tool. Thanks.
Thank you, Marcin. The definition of democracy, do you have a specific one that you relied on for the research, or just?
I mean, the one that would work across, I think, should definitely touch upon human rights, because this is something that people are sensitive when you provide them specific examples. So, of course, also in the past, when prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, also in countries which were a lot more pro-Russian than are now, the narratives or the information about the violation of human rights in Russia was understood and perceived critically. right? So the violations of human rights are definitely something that is perceived sensitive, also in the region of Central and Eastern Europe, where the freedoms have not been granted for several decades. So this is definitely the one, but it has to be, you cannot solve everything by communication, right? There has to be policies that are targeted the needs of the most vulnerable parts of population. So if someone doesn't have enough resources to pay for the energy bills during the energy crisis, you have, as the government, then you have to help those people because they won't care about democracy until their basic needs are met. So this is something that has to go, in line while the basic needs of people have to be met. Then we can start talking about the principles and the rights and the freedoms.
Thank you.
When it comes to narratives, I mean, it's a tactic that has actually been used by the Kremlin, but also by China. China has a 50-cent army of people that work in public institutions in China, and as soon as some disinformation or some, disaster or attack has occurred in China, they employ the 50-cent army to move the public attention in a particular way and praise it, or to just move the public attention from the negative information. And the similar thing has been done by the Kremlin when when the information about Bucha massacre have occurred. They try to immediately change and sway the public attention to different topics. So in this sense, I mean, yes, we can do that, but definitely we do not have millions and millions of people that conduct 50-cent army to do that. What we've been seeing is that you can reflect on certain things. You can reflect on the invasion, but if you are able to connect it with something that the people already experience, they themselves have a historical memory of. That's what really is most impactful. That's what resonates the most among the Central Eastern Europeans. So, for example, in Slovakia, we have a very active police. They have a specific account called Hoaxes and Frauds that debunk disinformation, but also point out to some cyber attacks, some attempts of frauds that are occurring in Slovakia or Czech Republic. And what they've been doing is that they, if some event comes up or with the war invasion of Ukraine, they've been trying to point out the similarities and try to point out the similarities in the sense that also make fun of them, don't be fooled. This has occurred. We've experienced it. Don't be fooled. So pointing out the fact that this is happening, but also pointing out the fact that this is a tool of influence operation, and pointing out the fact if it's possible that this has happened, we went through it, is an important way how we could reflect on the information operations that are being waged.
Okay, thank you. As we are closing, is there one message you would like the audience to go away with? Is there like a key message you want them to remember?
Just as a reflection to what has now been said, I think the message of the importance of controlling the narrative about different topics. So utilizing the not being a victim of other anti-democratic actors and not being in this constant reactive defensive mode that I think we have been in for the past almost a decade, that being able to proactively control the narrative about the refugees, to create our own stories, to create our own messaging that is reflecting of our values, that is personalized, that in using emotions is extremely important for us as democratic actors to do. And it's important to do it in cooperation because the other side is very, very well connected, networked, and cooperative. And we just need to boost our cooperation because there's so many of us and we can do it. We just need to focus our attention to that.
Maybe to follow up on Dominika, in order to really build resilience and make those big reforms happen, you really need a political will. You need politicians to walk the walk, talk the talk, to invest, make sure that those reforms are going to be reflected in budget lines, and that they're going to lead into the resilience building, and then they themselves are going to be spreading positive narratives. We're going to be conducting good strategic communication rather than utilizing disinformation themselves in order to appeal to their voters.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank our communication team, Zach Evans and the rest, and my own team, and Irina Smolina, who is humbly sitting at the back, who helped organize the event, and of course our speakers, Daria, Dominika, and Katarina. So please join me with a round of applause. Thank you to the audience and those that joined us online.